So let's talk about the general controls that you find on an amplifier. Whether it's tube or solid state, as far as the controls go, they're generally pretty much the same. I'm going to use this Mesa Boogie amplifier as an example, but I'm not going to be too specific in terms of this amplifier, because remember, as I said at the beginning, I'm not trying to replace any owner's manuals here. I want to give you an idea of what the general controls are on an amplifier and how you can maximize those controls to work for you. So first, here in the corner we have the input. The input is where you're going to plug in your guitar, or if you're going through a bunch of effects, you might, if you're running them in front, you might come out of the effects and then into the input. Here on this particular amp, the foot switch jack is below. The foot switch is just going to be your controller, your floorboard that allows you to control the various different aspects of this amplifier. Over here we've got a small toggle, and this is going to look different depending on which amplifier you're looking at, but on this one, this little toggle tells me whether I'm on channel 1 or channel 2, or whether I'm allowing the foot pedal to make that that assignment. So that's that middle position here. And then this toggle switch on this amp chooses whether I'm going to have a clean sound for channel 2 or whether I'm going to have a drive sound. So I guess the point of it, as they designed it here, is ultimately a 2-channel amp. That's most commonly what you're going to find, and your channel 1 is going to be clean, your channel 2 can be clean, or a drive. Now, that's not necessarily always the case. You might have the flexibility, depending on the amp, to make either channel 1 or channel 2 clean, or to have an overdrive. You will always find a gain knob on an amplifier, a treble, a mid, a bass, a presence, and a master. So let's talk about those things. Gain is the first stage of what's happening with your signal. If it's a tube amplifier, this is where you're deciding how much of the tube you're going to overdrive. In other words, how much input you're going to put into it. What happens is you start to distort the sound by overdriving the tube as you turn it up. That's where distortion really comes from, and that's why a lot of players like the tube distortion, because you're actually overdriving the tube and you're getting a very warm, distorted sound. This is in our preamp stage. Treble, mid, and bass, pretty self-explanatory. This is your EQ section here in your preamp. Then you've got your presence. Your presence just basically makes the sound, for lack of a better word, a little more present, and that's why they use it. So these are my channel 1 preamp tone and sound selection knobs. Here is the same thing for channel 2. So I have complete independent control of my channel 2 sound. They have a separate drive circuitry here on this amp. That's going to vary depending on what amplifier you're looking at. Most important thing is to recognize is here's my preamp 1, here's my preamp channel 2. Over here is my master section. All that's going to do is it's going to take everything that I've dialed up here in the preamp and put it through the power amp section, and I'm going to get my volume out of that. I've got my sound. Now I'm going to decide how loud I want my sound to be by adjusting my master switches. This amp happens to have a toggle here for 30 watts, 15 watts, and 5 watts. You might find that on some other amps as well. That allows you to basically cut down the overall power of the amplifier. And the purpose of that is that it allows you to overdrive your amplifier at a lower rating. In other words, a lot of times people feel that you have to turn an amplifier up very loud in order to get the sound that you want. In many cases that's true, but when you have the ability to maybe shut down a couple of the tubes, that allows you to overdrive your amplifier at a lower volume. In other words, get that sound that you really want at a lower volume. I mentioned earlier that you have obviously a power switch, but I was talking about the standby on a tube amplifier. Well, the standby switch allows you to keep your amplifier on, but prevents any sound from coming out. So that's how you preheat your tubes in order to obtain your tube sound right from your first note. I'm going to flip the amp around and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other features that are available. You can tell a lot by looking at the back of an amplifier. For example, clearly this is a 112 speaker configuration, and you can also see that it's an open back. Some amps have a closed back and others are open. Open back, a lot of blues players like them. They allow you to do a lot of things. They definitely have a characteristic of sound, but in the studio they're kind of nice too, because you have options to put microphones in different positions almost within the amplifier. Some engineers like to do that. Some of the advantages of a closed back, though, is that all the sound gets pushed forward. I tend to find that closed back cabinets are a little bit punchier sounding, and for me, while I like open back cabinets, if I'm playing an outdoor gig, sometimes I feel like I'm losing too much of my volume outdoors. So sometimes I try to prop it up against something else on the stage in order to push most of the sound forward. That's another advantage, though, to an open back cabinet, is you have further tonal control by deciding exactly where you're going to put your amp in relationship to the wall behind. I've found that in a lot of clubs when I'm playing, is if I push the amp a little bit closer or take it away from the wall, it's actually going to change the way my amp reacts. So that gives you some added tonal control. And as you can see here, we've got our glass tubes that I was talking about. And behind there, which is a little bit harder to see, are more glass tubes for the preamp section. So we've got our preamp glass tubes and then our power amp glass tubes. And then let's just take a look at the back here at some of the features that you'll find on lots of amplifiers. We've got a send and return switch here. Well, what that is that's the effects loop. You can either run your effects right out of your guitar. You plug your guitar into your effects and then out of your effects into your amp, as we were talking about before. But there's another option, which is to use the effects loop that's on the back of the amplifier. You have a send and return. When you're sending from it, you're taking your preamp sound and putting it through your effects, okay? If you're going straight from your guitar into the effects, into the amplifier, you're not actually modifying in your effects the sound of the amplifier. But by using the effects loop, you're already getting your tones as you have tuned it through the front of the amplifier using the EQ and gain stages. You're now taking that sound and putting it through your effects and then returning it here. And this is just a knob that allows you to adjust the level of signal that you're putting through your effects. Okay, so that's another way to alter your tone. You might like some effects going through the front of your amp, but you might like to put some in the effects loop. Here we've just got a reverb selection. I think on most amps you find these knobs on the front, but this is allowing, here in this case, independent reverb for channel 1 and for channel 2. Usually you just find one reverb on an amplifier for the overall sound. And you've got a bright reverb and warm reverb switch. You won't find that everywhere, but that happens to be on this amp. And also, I think because, as I mentioned before, tube amps get very warm, they've got a fan on here. But they've got a switch, fan on and fan off. And I'm guessing that it makes sense. You don't want that fan to be on when you've got a microphone in the back recording something for a record. And then you've just got some speaker output jacks here, so that allows you to take your sound and plug it into additional speaker cabinets. That's a nice feature, especially when you're working with a combo amp that has a 112 in it. If you can then put some extension cabinets on, you can get more tonal opportunities and options by using these various different jacks. And below here, you can't see it, but inside the amp is a spring reverb unit that almost goes the entire length of the amp here, and that's what's being used for the reverb. Spring reverb is a very common and really nice sounding reverb for guitars.